Hello? Oh, there we go. Now we're on. And love that musical interlude. Look, I'd like to start with the all-important issue of national security. Ambassador Modorowski, before you joined the government, you were a journalist focusing on international relations. As you think back on some of the events you covered during that time, how does the security threat that Russia poses to Europe right now compare? And is this truly the existential crisis that threatens Europe's stability and unity?
Thank you very much for your kind invitation and for this opportunity to explain and to highlight Poland's role in the ongoing crisis in Europe. And also, a very interesting question. As you rightly noted, I was a journalist for over 20 years. So in my previous capacity, I remember vividly one text I wrote just after the invasion of Georgia in 2008, which was a watershed moment also from our perspective in terms of considering and viewing Russia as an existential threat, not only to the eastern flank, to Central Europe, but also overall to, for example, to the Russian underbelly and to all those post-Soviet republics which popped up after the disintegration of the Soviet Union on Europe's map. And that particular piece was titled Monster Russia, not Mother Russia, Monster Russia. I'm not saying that I was prescient at the time, unlike subsequent Polish governments, which knew very well that, for instance, President Putin would one day weaponize energy, which he's doing right now as we speak. Again, I'm not saying that we have always been right about our perception of contemporary Russia and the authoritarian rule which took root in that country many years ago. But I think I'm blessed to have lived under both systems because I was born under communism, under the socialist yoke. I experienced command economy, and then I lived under democracy, liberalism, and free market economy in independent Poland after 1989. And believe me, I can now see vestiges, if you will, of Soviet mentality in today's Russia in various aspects. For example, that blatant disregard for human life and human dignity. I believe Oksana could tell us much more about that. Also that that view of international politics, foreign affairs, as a zero-sum game, both in Soviet and in Russian times. Nikita Khrushchev, the former Secretary General of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, once visited. He was a frequent visitor to here on American soil, but during one of his trips, he famously said, it was at the headquarters of the United Nations in New York City, he famously said, "History is on our side, we will bury you." And of course he was addressing the main enemy of the Soviet Union at the time, the United States. It was at the peak of the Cold War. I wonder how Mr. Putin's words today are reminiscent of what Nikita Khrushchev said at the time. For Soviet politicians and for Russian politicians, diplomacy has always been a zero-sum game. Someone has to win, and someone needs to be defeated. And I think Poland, myself, and many of my fellow countrymen understood that many decades ago, and not much has changed, actually, in contemporary Russia.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. Ambassador Haber, you served at the German embassy in Moscow.
A couple of times.
More than once. Knowing what you know about them, and taking into account Ambassador Modorowski's perspective as well, do you believe there is a genuine danger that Russia might escalate its malign reactions, whether in terms of cybersecurity attacks or attacking critical energy infrastructure, cutting off energy flows to Europe entirely? Or even, as some have threatened, the use of tactical nuclear weapons?
Well, you want me to look into the crystal ball, and I'm not going to do that. There are a number of variables we don't know, and that makes predictions very, very difficult. I would prefer to look at the facts. And so far, Russia has issued a number of threats, say against supply chains, say against Sweden and Finland joining NATO, and so forth. They didn't follow up on that. So far, they had focused on the Ukrainian war theater and had not expanded. Doesn't mean they won't do it. Doesn't mean they will not do clandestine action. Doesn't mean they will not escalate. But as we cannot, with sufficient certainty, predict how far they will go and how they will escalate, the only conclusion for us to take, to draw, is to be as clear as we possibly can on what we're going to do, on our unity, on our cohesion, on how we support Ukraine. We cannot afford to be misread. In this, not only our resilience is important, but also our capacity to deter. So let's focus on what we actually can do. That's the best we can do to deter Putin and make sure that all the threats that he has issued, not least with regard to nuclear, will not materialize.
Thank you. Ambassador Byrne-Nason, welcome to the Chamber. This is your first visit with us. I should have noted the same for Ambassador Modorowski. We're delighted to have you here, and welcome to Washington. National security is obviously not protected only on the battlefield, but also by responding to global challenges like climate change or food insecurity, which we talked about earlier, violence against women, or other human rights violations. You did recently arrive in Washington from your post at the UN in New York. As you think about your experience there, how important is it for the US and Europe to demonstrate unified leadership in tackling these challenges?
Well, thank you very much, Marjorie. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm definitely the new girl on the block. Just 7 weeks under my belt here, but I plan to get to know you very well. And I know Ireland has always had a friendly home here, so thank you for having me. Yes, I arrived from New York, having spent the last 2 years as Ireland's representative on the Security Council, and had the unfortunate distinction of being sitting at that table on the night that Putin began his illegal war, his invasion of Ukraine. And I can say that sitting at that table, which after all really is the top table of global diplomacy, it was such a shocking moment in terms of the realization of the boldness and the willingness to throw aside every international order, every international norm, from both a security and a humanitarian, human rights point of view. So Ireland, I would just say in parentheses here, in terms of EU-US cooperation, to note on that Security Council, Ireland was the only elected EU member. We followed in the very eminent footsteps of Germany, having served 2 very distinctive years there. But France, of course, a permanent member, but Ireland, France, and the United States, a really deep and close cooperation at that table in the response immediately to the invasion. I think it's important also to say that a very welcome development from the United States in the course of my time at the UN was that re-engagement by the United States in multilateralism, and that has paid in spades in the context of the UN, where Russia not only has been pursued at the Security Council, and Ireland leading amongst those in terms of calling Russia to account, calling them out in terms of the accountability that is now needed at, for example, the International Criminal Court, but also in isolating Russia amongst the nations of the earth. Russia is essentially completely isolated, with friends alone like North Korea and Syria in the General Assembly, so has become a pariah amongst nations because of the coalition of interest. And I have to emphasize that the US-European coalition of interest in the international environment, you know, is unparalleled, I would say. And it's a big mistake if we don't now grasp the powerful force that EU-US cooperation is, not just for international prosperity and economic growth, that's obvious, we may talk about that, but for global peace and stability. There is no other couple, if I can call us that, on the international stage which can deliver. And we know both China and Russia are very active right across the globe, from Africa through to the Pacific. I think the couple of the EU-US in international peace and security absolutely is the prime actor and the prime engine for global peace and stability. That, after all, is the fundamental for economic growth. So 100% committed, not just to having seen it in action at the Security Council in the UN, but also to knowing that it's the base from which we must move on.
Thank you. We've talked quite a bit about the energy crisis in Europe, of course, and the role that U.S. companies are playing in helping to address that crisis. Obviously, Europe's energy dependency on Russia is over. And now each country in Europe is reevaluating the sources and types of energy they require, whether it's LNG or nuclear or renewables. Ambassador Majerowski, what does energy security look like, both in the near term and more generally?
Quite interestingly, I think Europe has proven it's resilient. It's going to be a very painful lesson. Much depends on temperatures in the upcoming winter. And it's, by the way, a very brief digression. It's pretty hilarious to hear some European politicians being so worried about what their constituents are saying right now about the necessity to lower the temperatures in their swimming pools by 1 degree Celsius in December and in January. I do believe they will not need to do that. But going back to my point about resilience, I think Europe as such, or the European Union and all European institutions dealing with this issue have reacted pretty swiftly, quite efficiently. Speaking of my own country's role and preparedness to this eventuality, I would just like to remind you that Poland, again, I'm not saying that we have been prescient and right from the get-go, but we did have that hunch that something might happen, a very nasty development in this particular sphere. So, for instance, we inaugurated our first LNG terminal in 2017. Just 2 months ago, we opened the so-called Baltic Pipe, which is now transferring gas from the Norwegian continental shelf via Denmark to the Polish stretch of the Baltic coast. So diversification has always been on our agenda, actually since the transition in 1989. Our gas storage facilities are full, literally 100%, which does not mean, of course, that we are absolutely and entirely immune to gas blackmail, if you will, on the part of the Russian Federation. But of course, we are cooperating very tightly with our allies, both in the European Union and in NATO, to further diversify gas supplies. You have rightly noted that the role of American companies is absolutely crucial in this respect. And I do believe that building resilience, enhancing gas interconnectors, and deepening our cooperation in this area will help us survive the upcoming energy crisis in Europe.
Ambassador Haber, if I can build on that with you, what combination of policies and investments does Germany need to make to achieve that type of energy security? And what actions are required from your perspective, both from the EU and also from partner nations?
Well, it's a well-known fact that the German exposure was significant within Europe. And the violent onslaught by Russia on Ukraine had really jettisoned axioms of German strategic thinking for many decades. We had to withdraw from the dependency from Russia in lightning speed, which we did. We are out of Russian gas totally. We're out of Russian coal totally. And mind you, it was 55 and 50% of our coal and gas supplies, respectively, came from Russia before February 24th, will be out of Russian oil entirely by the end of the year. So that is a massive, massive shift. It requires a very complex set of answers, and very quickly so. And some of them need to be reconciled with a logic that is partially mutually exclusive. We need to diversify suppliers, which will include importing, say, LNG or fossil fuels to Germany. We want to, and we do, significantly reduce demand for gas. And we want to expedite the transition to renewables, which is also happening. So transition to renewables and importing fossil fuels, that's what I meant. These are complex and somewhat contradictory trajectories, but we need to do it. We also have expanded the life cycles of our nuclear power plants, which is well known. That's a very difficult domestic decision for any German government. This German government did it because it was required to stay on course. We are in the midst of debating within Europe how to deal with the gas prices, how to set up a collective purchasing power, how to coordinate the reduction of consumption of gas. We have taken a number of decisions with regard to the windfall profits and with regard to a windfall profit tax within Europe. But sitting here in this audience, my message is we will be interested in importing LNG from the United States. That will require adjustments. We are fully aware of that. We are in the midst of building LNG regasification floating terminals. We'll be having 5 by the end of next year, 4 by early next year. So that again is indicative of a significant shift. Mind you, there was none before February 24. So I think what we've seen over the past year is a tectonic shift in our energy strategy, and it has a transatlantic pillar.
Thank you. Obviously, the energy crisis is but one facet of the economic headwinds that we've been experiencing, seen in Europe as well as here in the United States. And the forecasts suggest a very difficult time ahead for Europe in particular. Ambassador Byrne-Nason, I wonder if I could start with you and ask about your government's plans to revitalize economic growth and to encourage investment.
Thank you very much, Marjorie. If I might, just before I answer your question, I just wanted to pick up on a point that Marek made there about the EU coherence and the solidarity within the EU. I'm someone who spent a long time, some would say maybe too long, in the corridors in Brussels, and I certainly would never have predicted what I have seen in terms of EU's coherent response and strength, really, in coming together. Economic crisis followed by COVID, followed by Ukraine. This has been quite an extraordinary period of a golden era, almost perversely, for the European Union and for all the naysayers, and indeed in the wake of Brexit, I think it's a pause for thought moment. So I didn't want to let it pass, just to say that the EU response, not least now in the field of energy, if you listen to what both Emily and Marek have said, Ireland's exposure on the energy front directly to Russia was at 3%, so very low. But the impetus for the development of our renewable sector is extraordinary now. I think we have one of the most ambitious plans in terms of getting to 80% of renewables in the coming period. So just to say that is a driver. On the economic front, certainly Ireland facing, as you said, the same headwinds. Our inflation rate, we figure, will pan out over the year this year at about 8.5%, 7% next year. So slightly less than others are experiencing. We've downgraded our growth forecast to about 1.25%, but it's still on the positive side. What we plan to do certainly is, we're one of the most open economies in the world. We're small, we're innovative, but we plan to continue the really, really fundamental, I would say, mission critical relationship we have with the United States. As an FDI source for Ireland, the United States provides 64% of that FDI, which is traditionally, of course, well known. I think the fact that that kind of particularly multinational investment comes to Ireland is an illustration of how competitive, how skilled, and how indeed a friendly base we are in Ireland for economic growth for US investors. What's a bit less well known, in my view, and I picked this up in my 7 weeks here already, is that Ireland is actually the US's 9th source of FDI. And if you think of scale issues, that's even for me as an Irish person paid to promote my country, that's quite an impressive figure. That supports well over 100,000 jobs here in the United States. So we plan to continue to grow that relationship across all the sectors, from pharma through financial services, high tech, obviously. And if I can come back to the EU-US part of that relationship, as a committed multilateralist, I'm just astounded and delighted to see the amount of work underway between the EU and the US on our economic partnership. We see Ireland sitting very comfortably in the middle of that as a connector, but to have had no EU-US economic summit in 7 years and to have broken that drought, extraordinary. To see that the work that's underway now, high-level, important discussions on the economic front about relations with Russia and China, consultations underway on the Indo-Pacific region, working on climate, energy, security, home affairs. All of this goes to say we now have a muscular, integrated and intimate set of relations, and Ireland sees that as absolutely a driver of economic growth by definition, and we plan to take full advantage of that.
Thank you. Ambassador Haber, can you talk a little bit about Germany's plans for revitalizing economic growth? Obviously, substantial investments have been made to help German economy and the German people in confronting the current crisis. And we also know quite a bit about Germany's commitment to balanced budgets. Can you talk a little bit about how you can generate that revitalized economic growth going forward in those circumstances?
We will also be hit by the economic development. Projections say that for early next year, we'll see a slight recession in Germany. But here again, I would say there are a lot of variables not known as yet. So let's wait and see about that. The German government has seen the crisis as a chance to some extent. During Easter, the government adopted what we call the Eastern Package, which is to accelerate a transition to renewables. The goal being that by 2030, 80% of electricity generation comes from renewables. They've also taken a number of steps to streamline regulation and to make decisions easier. In addition to that, the government has adopted only recently a package which will make available up to 200 billion euros in the years between 2022 and 2024. That's a ceiling, and it is designed to do a number of things, from protecting systemically relevant gas importers to securing consumers and so forth. So that will certainly ease and cushion the economic development and make sure that Germany, which after all to some extent is an economic engine in Europe, will not be affected with spillover effects for other European countries. May I also build on what Geraldine said? Because I agree. There is, I needn't go into the details of German investment in the United States or the trade relationship. That's well known. But we have heard before in the discussion on the links between strategic and economic security, how closely they were interlinked. And I think observation is in place that there's a conversation to be had on shaping alliances, shaping coherence, shaping strategic consistence, and using that for our collective power projection in a situation where the global balance is under stress. And what's happening in the economic field. These are not separate universes. And I hear a lot about onshoring and reshoring and friendshoring. And I think, again, there's a conversation to be had. There's one thing if you reshore production lines from countries, and especially in fields where sensitive ecosystems are affected. But it's another story if that affects allied partners and will have a significant impact on their economic prospects, not least in the face of a recession. So my plea here would be we should always contextualize economic developments and strategic security developments do not exist in separate universes, and stability is indivisible.
Ambassador Majerowski, I'm sure you know well that a number of the Chamber's member companies are significant investors in Poland. And we've had the great good fortune to host President Duda on a couple of occasions for conversations with those executives about those investments.
I used to work in Lisbon.
Well, there you go. You know well about the investments. Can you talk a little bit about what Poland is doing to encourage investment?
Since Emily mentioned friendshoring, I think it would be fair to say that one of our priorities, and I'm not only talking about the Polish government, would be to uphold that image of Europe as the best place on earth to invest. Poland has oftentimes been depicted in foreign media as a country which may be a little bit unstable. Also in the face of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. We are a borderline state, and that perception is partially understandable, but completely distorted. I believe that Poland has never been more stable politically and economically, even under these peculiar circumstances. Now, of course, we are now trying to address myriad challenges, inflation being one of them, which has not been mentioned here yet. But I think that political and economic stability should be always one of the issues we should highlight very robustly in our conversations with potential investors. And again, it's not only about Poland, it's not only about Romania, the Baltics, but also about Germany, France, and Sweden. Europe has always been a magnet for foreign investors, and I believe that it will remain in the same role for at least for the foreseeable future. Now, and I think that I think Emily said that Russia is now completely isolated. I don't agree with you entirely, because I do believe that we still have some margin of maneuver in terms of turning the screws and tightening the economic noose around Russia. Russia, unlike some other countries in Europe, paradoxically, has always been perceived, no matter what happens in Russia domestically and how authoritarian Putin's rule has been so far, Russia was perceived for many years as a reliable commercial partner, okay? A gas supplier, seller of an endless array of raw materials, also to Europe, also to Poland. Now this perception has crumbled big time. And going back to the point of friendshoring, I think that it is also important to put emphasis on values, combining them with our commercial interests. So I do believe, for example, we have not dwelled for too long on China in this conversation, but I think that one of the crucial questions we are asking ourselves, and I believe we don't have yet a ready answer to this, is whether China is the United States and Europe's common foe, and to what extent should we forge an alliance which would maybe not combat China's influence and China's economic expansion worldwide, but maybe we should brace ourselves for a very harsh period of time in which the rivalry with China will overshadow actually all other issues we are coping with today.
Ambassador Halber, I want to come back to you on this question of China and transatlantic engagement. Chancellor Scholz was in Beijing recently, and I think reflecting by taking an executive delegation with him, the importance that Germany attaches rightly to robust commercial relations with China. The US and Europe have been, I think, increasingly on the same page about the challenge that China poses, both not just economically, but also especially from a geostrategic standpoint. But there are questions about whether we can be on the same page about how to balance the commercial relationship with those geostrategic challenges. Do you see the US and Europe able to come more closely together in responding to the challenges that China represents?
Well, absolutely. The European Union, I think 2 years ago, had qualified China as a systemic rival, a competitor and a partner. And I think the observation is fair that within these 2 years or more than 2 years that have passed, China has become much more of a systemic rival than the authors of the paper at the time had predicted. But it will continue to be complex. Let's take a couple of prisms. The first prism is that as a systemic rival, China is using tools and instruments that actually attack the way we want to live. So they attack democracy and societies, and we have a huge interest in shaping a collective response with regard to resilience of our society, with regard of deterring China from doing that, and from being able to defend ourselves. On the prism of competitor, we have also profound shared interest. We have, and in two ways. The first way is we want to make sure that there's a level playing field. We want to make sure that there is reciprocity, and China usually doesn't do reciprocity. We want to make sure about market access. And here we need to collaborate closely, because if we don't, we will fracture our collective power. But we also have to work on reshaping supply chains in sensitive ecosystems. And here, again, we have to work and coordinate ourselves. And the aspect of friendshoring comes in here as well. So cooperation on that is of profound importance. And if we don't, we lose collective clout. But finally, on the partner issue, there will be and continue to be big global issues where we will be needing China. Whether they cooperate and how they cooperate, that's another business. But ignoring China would simply harm ourselves, because China is too big to ignore on climate issues or on health issues and on many other global challenges. So even if our ambition level is fairly low, the aspect of partner cannot be completely eclipsed on these issues. So I would continue to see a three-pronged approach with trend gravitating towards dealing with China as a systemic rival.
Ambassador Byrne-Nason, I know we're coming up toward the end of our time, but I want to ask you, again, hearkening back to your experience most recently at the UN, how important is it for the US and Europe to demonstrate leadership in trying to build alliances, in pushing back against countries, not just China, but other countries that don't necessarily share our commitment to democracy and individual freedom?
Absolutely fundamental is the answer. And China is not a bad example to start with. I think it comes to all of the wise things you heard Emily and Marek say about the relationship, but also to the values and principles that we espouse as Europeans and American citizens. My experience of China at the Security Council, I think it's worth just a little moment to say that, you know, as a permanent member, they are now a much more important player politically than they were even a decade ago. I mean, they have really found their place in the global conversation and are not shy about using their influence at the table. In a parenthesis, I will say that during my time at the Council, and particularly in relation to Ukraine, China was deeply uncomfortable geopolitically in terms of it's, of course, no limits, I think was the term used in terms of their friendship with Russia, but deep discomfort with the attack on Ukraine, to the point that China did not support Russia in two key early decisions of the Security Council. They stood back, they abstained. So I think it's worth saying that China is also looking to its own interests. That was partly in relation to Europe, but Marjorie, you broadened the question, and I'll segue into that in terms of the global south. And I think that's something that the EU and US and the return of the US to multilateralism, to multilateral cooperation really points up, because, you know, a lot of economic potential in the future will come from the global south. And I think if we watch what China has done economically in its relations across Africa, I've been astounded. You can hardly mention any one of the 54 countries in Africa where China is not present on the ground and economically influential. Russia tends to be influential in a security sense there. We need to cooperate on that. But also, I think in terms of for example, the Summit for Democracy that President Biden hosted recently, in terms of promoting our basic values of respect for human rights, which we know neither of those two countries I've mentioned espouse in the same way that we do, equality, fundamental promotion of respect, anti-racism, xenophobia, etc. All of that really is the stuff, I think, of the shared moral values on which we have built our societies. And if the EU and the US are cooperating on those, countries like China and Russia have opponents that are worthy of, at least of being heard from them. So I think that it's a really, really critical relationship.
Fantastic. We actually are running over time, but I have to take a moment right at the end here and ask each of you briefly, what is the most important message that you're conveying to the Biden administration today?
On the final note, I believe there is one challenge we have not yet mentioned in this conversation, namely the necessity to improve our cooperation in terms of sharing knowledge and technology. There is a natural and maybe even inevitable competition between Europe and the United States in this particular field. But if we don't improve this kind of cooperation, we will never be able to compete with China more efficiently.
Ambassador Haber?
I would say amen to that. and add, during my time here, and even looking back, I haven't seen a better transatlantic relationship than I do now. I would direct the attention to the holistic aspects of a relationship. Don't treat aspects of the relationship in different, shall we say, in secluded and isolated, surgically isolated environments. They're all interconnected.
Ambassador Byrne-Nason, you'll have a quick handover, I think, next month, the role of the Taoiseach to Taoiseach Varadkar moving into that role. What is the most important message he will be carrying to the administration?
I know you didn't expect this, but you gave me the perfect segue, because the current Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, has a very favourite phrase in our own language, Ní neart go cur le céile. We're only strong if we pull in the same direction. And I can't say how often we are saying that to the United States administration. We missed you when you weren't by our side. I fully agree with Emily that this was one of the most important developments to see the EU-US relationship be strengthened. And it's hard in any relationship to build confidence and trust. It takes time, and it's a building block day by day, working, through all of those levels of our governments to create that huge relationship that matters and that's influential. So we need to keep working hard at this. Confidence will return, but we can't be in any way staccato nor fragmented. As Emily pointed out, it's a holistic relationship.
And I think that's a perfect note to end on. I can't stress enough how grateful we are for the relationship between the Chamber and each of your embassies and each of your governments. So thank you for joining us here this morning. We look forward to continuing the dialogue. Please join me in thanking our guests.